The crystal glass shattered against the mahogany floor. Burgundy wine spreading like blood across the Persian rug. Obadiah Westcombe clutched his throat, his birthday celebration transforming into his final breath in the span of 17 minutes. This is the story of how one enslaved girl turned a master's moment of triumph into his grave, using nothing more than deadly nightshade and the bitter patience that slavery breeds in those who have nothing left to lose. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone echoed through the humid August evening in 1855, mixing with the distant chug of steamboats along the Mississippi River. The Westcombe mansion on Chouteau Avenue reeked of expensive tobacco and French perfume, its marble floors cool beneath the feet of servants who moved like shadows between rooms draped in crimson velvet. In the wine cellar below, 20-year-old Celia pressed her palm against the rough stone wall, feeling the vibrations of laughter from the dining room above. She had been born into this house, raised in its suffocating embrace of wealth built on human misery. Her mother, Temperance, had died giving birth to her in the servants' quarters, and Celia had grown up knowing only the Westcombe family's peculiar brand of refined cruelty. Unlike the plantation slaves who toiled under open skies, Celia lived in the strange intimacy of domestic bondage, where brutality wore silk gloves and spoke in cultured tones. Obadiah Westcombe was celebrating his 45th birthday on this sweltering August 23rd. The merchant had built his fortune trading in human cargo, shipping enslaved people down the Mississippi to sugar plantations in Louisiana. His guests, fellow traders, city officials, and society wives filled the house with a kind of genteel conversation that treats human suffering as a business expense. Court records, St. Louis County, August 1855. The defendant Celia, property of O. Westcombe, accused of administering poison with malicious intent. But tonight was different. Tonight, Celia had decided that Obadiah Westcombe would drink his last toast. The idea had germinated 3 months earlier, on a May evening when Westcombe had sold Celia's only friend, a young woman named Seraphina Hallowell, to a broker heading south. Seraphina had begged, had thrown herself at Westcombe's feet, had promised anything if she could stay. Westcombe had simply adjusted his cufflinks and asked the broker if he preferred payment in gold or banknotes. The nightshade had been surprisingly easy to obtain. Nathaniel Grimshaw, the elderly apothecary on Market Street, kept belladonna tincture for treating various ailments, though he warned customers about its lethal properties in large doses. Celia had visited his shop 3 times over 2 months, each time purchasing small amounts for different manufactured ailments: headaches, insomnia, feminine troubles. Grimshaw never questioned a slave girl's need for medicine. In his experience, the enslaved suffered more ailments than anyone cared to acknowledge. The poison was beautiful, really. Deadly nightshade berries looked innocent enough, dark purple and sweet, like tiny grapes that promised nothing more than a pleasant tartness on the tongue. But Celia knew their secret, how they could stop a heart in minutes, how they could turn a celebration into a funeral without anyone suspecting murder until it was far too late. Death grows in gardens. The dinner party that night followed Westcombe's usual pattern. Octavia Draymore, the mayor's wife, regaled the table with gossip about which families had lost their fortunes in recent riverboat gambling. Silas Redmond, Westcombe's business partner, discussed the profitable expansion of their trading routes. The conversation flowed like the wine, smooth, expensive, and tinged with the bitter aftertaste of other people's misery. Celia moved through the dining room with practiced invisibility, refilling glasses and clearing plates while the guests discussed her as if she were furniture. She had perfected the art of being simultaneously indispensable and unnoticed, a skill that slavery teaches with harsh efficiency. Her hands remained steady as she poured wine, even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The nightshade tincture waited in a small vial tucked inside her apron pocket. She had calculated the dose carefully enough to ensure death, but not so much that it would leave obvious traces. The bitter almond scent would be masked by the wine's own complex bouquet, and by the time symptoms appeared, she would be long gone from the dining room. Medical journal entry, Dr. Pryson's. Gideon Crowthorne, 1855. Belladonna poisoning presents initially as flushing and fever, progressing rapidly to delirium, convulsions, and respiratory failure. At 9:47 that evening, Westcombe called for a toast to commemorate his birthday. He stood at the head of his table, crystal goblet raised, surrounded by friends who had grown wealthy alongside him by treating human beings as livestock. The irony was not lost on Celia. This man who had profited from the systematic destruction of families was about to be destroyed by someone he considered property. She poured his wine with the same careful precision she brought to every task. The Nightshade tincture mixed seamlessly with the deep red liquid, invisible as it swirled in the crystal. Westcombe took the glass with the casual confidence of a man who had never imagined that his possessions might possess him in return. The first sip went down smoothly. The second followed without incident. But as Westcombe raised the goblet for a third taste, something flickered in his eyes, not suspicion, not yet, but a moment of confusion that would soon bloom into terror. What would you do if you knew that your next breath might be your last, but you had no idea why? The glass slipped from Westcombe's fingers as the first wave of poison began its work, and Celia stepped back into the shadows, knowing that in 17 minutes, everything would change forever. Take a moment to let us know. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story has captured your attention, hit that like button and subscribe, because the darkest chapters are still to come. Obadiah Westcombe's face flushed crimson as he stumbled backward, his hand flying to his collar as if the silk cravat had suddenly transformed into a noose. The dinner guests froze mid-conversation, their laughter dying in their throats as they watched their host begin his final performance. These 17 minutes would determine whether Celia's calculated revenge would pass for natural causes, or whether her act of rebellion would lead her directly to the gallows. The dining room erupted into controlled chaos, the kind of restrained panic that wealthy people practice when tragedy threatens to embarrass them in front of their peers. Octavia Draymore dropped her napkin and rushed to Westcombe's side, her silk gloves fluttering uselessly as she tried to steady him. The scent of burning candle wax mixed with expensive cologne and the sharp tang of spilled wine, while the grandfather clock in the corner ticked away each precious second with mechanical indifference. Celia retreated to the servants' corridor that ran behind the dining room, her ear pressed against the thin wall that separated the enslaved from their masters. Through the wallpaper and plaster, she could hear Westcombe's breathing grow labored, punctuated by the concerned murmurs of his guests. Her fingers traced the empty vial in her apron pocket, the glass still warm from her body heat. The Nightshade was working exactly as Nathaniel Grimshaw's medical texts had promised. First came the flushing and fever, followed by confusion and difficulty speaking. Westcombe tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out slurred and disconnected, as if his tongue had forgotten how to form coherent thoughts. Police report, August 24, 1855. Witness Silas Redmond stated the deceased appeared intoxicated, though he had consumed no more wine than usual at such gatherings. Dr. Gideon Crowthorne arrived within minutes, his black medical bag clutched in hands that had seen too many unexplained deaths in St. Louis's wealthy districts. The physician was a thin, nervous man who had built his reputation treating the ailments of the merchant class: gout, nervous exhaustion, and the occasional bout of tropical fever contracted during business trips to New Orleans. He was not prepared for what he found in the Westcombe dining room. Silas Redmond helped carry Westcombe to the parlor sofa, the unconscious man's body already beginning to convulse in small, rhythmic spasms. Crowthorne felt for a pulse and found it racing like a runaway horse, far too fast to sustain life for much longer. The pupils were dilated to pinpricks, and the skin burned with an internal fire that no fever should produce. Justice wears many faces tonight. The guests began to whisper among themselves, their voices carrying the particular tone that accompanies tragedy when it strikes someone else's house. Temperance Fairvale, Westcombe's elderly aunt, suggested calling for the minister. Others wondered aloud whether they should summon the police, though no one could articulate exactly what crime might have been committed. Celia moved through the house with practiced efficiency, bringing cool water and clean towels as requested, playing the role of the concerned servant, while internally counting down the minutes until Westcombe's heart would finally stop. She had studied the progression of belladonna poisoning with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, the same focus that had helped her memorize which guests preferred their coffee black, which took sugar, and exactly how much Nightshade would kill a man of Westcombe's weight and constitution. The irony was exquisite. These people who had grown rich by controlling every aspect of enslaved lives now found themselves utterly powerless to control death when it came calling for one of their own. They stood around Westcombe's convulsing form like actors who had forgotten their lines, wealthy and educated, but reduced to helpless observers of forces beyond their comprehension. At 10 minutes past 10, Dr. Crowthorne made his first mistake. He administered a dose of laudanum, hoping to calm Westcombe's convulsions, not realizing that the opiate would only accelerate the Nightshade's deadly work. The combination sent Westcombe into a final seizure that lasted 43 seconds and ended with a silence so complete that even the grandfather clock seemed to pause in respect. Coroner's notes, August 25, 1855. Subject expired at 10:12 p.m. following symptoms consistent with apoplexy, though the rapidity of decline suggests possible cardiac episode. The room fell utterly quiet. Octavia Draymore began to sob with the theatrical grief that society women cultivate for such occasions. Silas Redmond closed his business partner's eyes and muttered something about the Lord's mysterious ways. Dr. Crowthorne packed his instruments with hands that trembled slightly, already composing the death certificate that would blame natural causes for what had been methodical murder. Through it all, Celia stood in the doorway with downcast eyes and folded hands, the picture of a grieving servant who had lost her master. Inside, she felt something she had never experienced before. Not joy, exactly, but a profound sense of completion, as if a debt that had been accumulating for 20 years had finally been paid in full. But as the guests began to file out into the humid August night, whispering their condolences and making plans for the funeral, Celia noticed something that made her blood run cold. Dr. Crowthorne was studying Westcombe's fingernails with unusual intensity, and when he thought no one was looking, he scraped a sample into a small envelope. Some secrets refuse to stay buried, especially when they leave traces in dead men's hands. Dr. Gideon Crowthorne held the envelope containing Westcombe's fingernail scrapings up to the gaslight, watching tiny particles of what looked like crushed plant matter glitter against the paper. His hands shook as he sealed the sample, knowing that what he suspected could hang a young woman. The next 48 hours would determine whether Celia's perfect crime would unravel under scientific scrutiny, or whether the word of a respected physician would be enough to condemn an enslaved girl without trial. The morgue beneath St. Louis City Hospital reeked of carbolic acid and decay, its stone walls weeping moisture in the August heat. The sound of water dripping into metal pans provided a steady rhythm that matched Crowthorne's accelerating heartbeat as he examined Westcombe's corpse by candlelight. The texture of the examination table, worn smooth by countless bodies, felt cold beneath his palms as he leaned closer to study the dead man's features. Crowthorne had seen belladonna poisoning before, during his medical training in Philadelphia. A wealthy merchant's wife had died from accidentally consuming too many pain remedies containing the extract, and the symptoms matched exactly what he had witnessed in the Westcombe dining room. The dilated pupils, the flushed skin, the rapid pulse, followed by sudden cardiac arrest, all textbook signs of nightshade toxicity. But proving poisoning and identifying the poisoner were entirely different challenges. In 1855 Missouri, the legal system operated on a simple hierarchy. The word of white men carried weight, white women deserved protection, and enslaved people possessed no legal standing whatsoever. Celia could be executed on Crowthorne's suspicion alone, without the benefit of evidence that would be required to convict a white defendant. Missouri Criminal Code 1855. Any slave convicted of murdering his master shall suffer death by hanging, such execution to be carried out within 30 days of sentencing. The doctor's investigation began with methodical precision. He interviewed the dinner guests separately, asking each to recall exactly what they had observed during Westcombe's final minutes. Octavia Draymore insisted that her host had seemed perfectly healthy until the moment he collapsed. Silas Redmond mentioned that Westcombe had been drinking wine throughout the evening, but no more than usual at such gatherings. The pattern that emerged was troubling in its consistency. Every witness agreed that Westcombe's symptoms had appeared suddenly, with no warning signs or preceding illness. The timeline was precise. He had raised his glass for the birthday toast at 9:47, taken several sips of wine, and collapsed by 9:52. 5 minutes from health to death was far too rapid for natural causes. Meanwhile, Celia maintained her facade of grieving servitude with remarkable composure. She helped prepare Westcombe's body for burial, washing the corpse with the same careful attention she had brought to serving his meals. Her hands remained steady as she closed his eyes and folded his arms across his chest, showing no sign of the satisfaction that burned quietly in her chest. The other household servants noticed nothing unusual in her behavior. She continued her daily routines, polishing silver, dusting furniture, preparing meals for the remaining family members with the same efficiency that had made her indispensable to the Westcombe household. If anything, she seemed more attentive than usual, as if Westcombe's death had reminded her how precarious her position truly was. Truth leaves the smallest footprints, but Crowthorne's suspicions crystallized when he discovered something the other guests had missed. The wine glass that Westcombe had been drinking from showed traces of a bitter residue around the rim, barely visible but detectable to someone who knew what to look for. When he tested the residue with a drop of sulfuric acid, a simple field test he had learned for identifying alkaloids, the sample turned a distinctive green color that confirmed the presence of belladonna extract. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Westcombe had been poisoned, and the poison had been administered in his wine. The question now was not whether murder had been committed, but who had access to both the victim's drink and a supply of deadly nightshade. Crowthorne spent the morning of August 25th visiting every apothecary shop in St. Nine, Louis, showing each proprietor a sketch of Celia and asking whether they had sold belladonna preparations to anyone matching her description. Most shop owners barely glanced at the drawing. Enslaved people were invisible to them, their faces interchangeable and instantly forgettable. But Nathaniel Grimshaw, the elderly apothecary on Market Street, paused when he saw the sketch. He remembered the young woman who had visited his shop 3 times over the summer, always purchasing small amounts of belladonna tincture for various ailments. She had been polite, well-spoken, and had paid in silver coins rather than the copper pennies that most servants carried. Apothecary records. N. Grimshaw. Sons. May 15. Belladonna tincture, 1 dram headache remedy. June 22. Belladonna tincture, 1 dram feminine complaints. July 30. Belladonna tincture, 2 drams. Insomnia treatment. The pattern was clear to anyone who understood the cumulative nature of the purchases. Individually, each transaction appeared innocent small amounts of medicine for common ailments. Together, they represented enough concentrated nightshade extract to kill 3 grown men. Armed with this evidence, Crowthorne knew he faced a moral dilemma that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could report his findings to the authorities and watch as Celia was dragged to the gallows within a month, Or he could remain silent and allow a murderer to escape justice, knowing that she might kill again if the opportunity arose. The decision would be taken out of his hands sooner than he expected, because someone else had been watching Celia very carefully, and that someone was about to make a proposition that would change everything. Serafina Hallowell stepped out of the shadows behind the carriage house, her bare feet silent on the wet cobblestones as she approached Celia in the pre-dawn darkness. The woman, Westcombe, had sold 3 months earlier, was supposed to be hundreds of miles away, working sugar fields in Louisiana until death claimed her. Instead, she had returned to offer Celia the most dangerous gift imaginable, an escape route that would require them both to vanish forever or die trying. The stable yard reeked of horse manure and damp straw, while the distant sound of roosters crowing mixed with the early morning clatter of milk wagons on Chouteau Avenue. The rough wooden fence posts felt splintered and weathered beneath Celia's palm as she steadied herself against the shock of seeing her closest friend alive and free. In the growing light, she could see that Serafina's hands bore fresh scars from plantation work, and her dark skin carried the pallor of someone who had been living underground. Serafina had escaped her Louisiana plantation during a yellow fever outbreak that killed half the field hands and left the overseers too sick to pursue runaways. She had made her way north through a network of abolitionists and freed slaves, sleeping in root cellars and abandoned barns, following the North Star toward a freedom that remained precarious and conditional even in Missouri. But she had not come to St. Louis seeking sanctuary. She had come for Celia, and she had arrived just in time to witness the aftermath of Westcombe's death through the dining room window. "I saw what you did," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning sounds of the awakening city. "I saw you pour something into his wine, and I saw him die." Her words carried no judgment, only a mixture of admiration and terror at the risks her friend had taken. Celia's first instinct was denial, but the expression on Serafina's face made lies impossible. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the truth that could hang them both if spoken in the wrong company. Underground Railroad Records, 1855. The network extends through Missouri via safe houses in St. Borm, Charles, Herman, and Jefferson City, with particular danger in urban areas where slave catchers operate openly. The conversation that followed would reshape both their lives. Serafina explained that she had been watching the Westcombe house for 2 weeks, planning to help Celia escape before Westcombe could sell her, as he had sold so many others. The timing of the poisoning had been pure coincidence, but it created an opportunity that might never come again. Dr. Crowthorne's investigation was closing in. Serafina had overheard him questioning shopkeepers about belladonna purchases, and it was only a matter of hours before the authorities would come for Celia. But the chaos following Westcombe's sudden death had also created confusion about the household's immediate future. Estate lawyers were arguing over inheritance, relatives were competing for control of assets, and in the bureaucratic fog, one missing slave girl might go unnoticed for days or even weeks. The plan Serafina proposed was audacious in its simplicity. They would leave St. Louis that very morning, traveling north toward the Illinois border, where a Quaker family named the Hallowells, distant relatives of Serafina's former surname, operated a station on the Underground Railroad. From there, they could continue toward Canada and the promise of genuine freedom, not just the temporary reprieve that Missouri offered to runaway slaves. Vengeance demands its price, but the escape would require resources they did not possess: travel documents, food for the journey, and most critically, enough money to pay the ferrymen and stagecoach drivers who asked no questions as long as their palms were greased with silver. Serafina had accumulated a small amount during her journey north, but it would not be enough to get them both to safety. That was when Celia revealed the secret she had been keeping even from herself. Over the years, she had been systematically stealing from the Westcombe household, not money, which would have been missed, but small valuable items that could be converted to cash. A silver thimble here, a gold button there, a mother-of-pearl hair comb that Westcombe's late wife would never need again. She had hidden them in a loose floorboard beneath her sleeping pallet, accumulating enough portable wealth to purchase their freedom if the opportunity ever arose. The irony was perfect. Westcombe's own possessions would finance the escape of the woman who had murdered him. As they crept back toward the servants' quarters to retrieve Celia's hidden cash, neither woman noticed the figure watching them from an upstairs window. Temperance Fairvale, Westcombe's elderly aunt, had been unable to sleep following her nephew's death. She had risen early to pray for his soul, but instead found herself witnessing something that would force her to choose between family loyalty and moral principle. Estate records. Westcombe versus Westcombe, 1,855. Temperance Fairvale, being of sound mind, hereby contests the distribution of her deceased nephew's human property, citing moral objections to the institution of slavery. The old woman had never approved of her nephew's involvement in the slave trade, but she had maintained silence out of family obligation. Now, watching Celia and her mysterious companion plan their escape, she faced a decision that would define the remainder of her life. She could sound the alarm and have both women captured before they reached the city limits, or she could turn away from the window, return to her prayers, and pretend she had seen nothing at all. What she chose to do would determine whether Celia's perfect murder would lead to perfect freedom, or whether both women would hang before the week ended. Temperance Fairvale pressed her trembling fingers against the cold window pane as she watched Celia and Serafina slip through the morning shadows toward the servants' quarters. The 80-year-old woman faced a choice that would either damn her immortal soul or redeem a lifetime of complicit silence. Her decision in the next 10 minutes would determine whether two young women would taste freedom or swing from the gallows before autumn leaves began to fall. The floorboards of the guest bedroom creaked beneath Temperance's feet as she paced, her nightgown rustling like dried leaves in the pre-dawn stillness. The scent of her nephew's pipe tobacco still lingered in the house, mixing with the faint odor of death that seemed to seep through the very walls. Her arthritic hands gripped the window ledge as she watched the two figures emerge from the servants' entrance, a small cloth bundle clutched between them. For 60 years, Temperance had lived as the spinster sister in a family built on human bondage. She had watched her brothers and nephews trade in flesh, while she maintained the fiction that their wealth came from honest commerce. She had served tea to buyers and sellers of human souls, had smiled politely when dinner conversation turned to the relative merits of field hands versus house slaves, had remained silent when children were torn from their mothers' arms and sold to distant plantations. Her nephew's sudden death had shattered that carefully constructed wall of denial. Seeing Celia move through the house with such composed efficiency in the hours following the poisoning had forced Temperance to confront an uncomfortable truth. She admired the girl's courage. Personal diary. Temperance Fairvale, August 1855. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but perhaps not so mysterious as we pretend. Sometimes justice wears the face of those we least expect to deliver it. The moral mathematics of the situation were complex. Celia had committed murder, a sin that demanded punishment under both divine and human law. But she had killed a man who had grown wealthy by destroying families, who had treated human beings as livestock, who had perpetuated a system of cruelty that infected every aspect of Southern society. Was her crime justice delayed, or was justice simply another word for revenge? Temperance knew that her silence would make her complicit in murder, but she also knew that raising the alarm would make her complicit in something far worse, the destruction of two young women, whose only real crime was refusing to accept the fate that white society had imposed upon them. The decision crystallized as she watched Dr. Crowthorne's carriage turn onto Chouteau Avenue, arriving earlier than expected for his follow-up examination of Westcombe's remains. The physician's investigation had clearly progressed faster than anyone anticipated, and his grim expression suggested that he carried warrants for arrest rather than condolences for the bereaved. Freedom hangs by threads. Instead of calling out to alert the household, Temperance did something that surprised even herself. She opened the guest room window and dropped a small silver bell onto the cobblestones below, not loudly enough to wake the neighbors, but sharp enough to warn the two women that danger was approaching. Celia and Serafina froze at the sound, their eyes scanning the house until they spotted the pale figure in the upstairs window. Temperance raised one finger to her lips in a gesture of silence, then pointed toward the back gate that led to the alley behind the property. The message was clear. Run now, while there was still time. The two women needed no further encouragement. They slipped through the gate just as Crowthorne's carriage pulled to a stop in front of the main entrance. The doctor emerged with two city constables, their brass buttons glinting in the morning sun as they strode toward the front door with the purposeful gait of men carrying official warrants. Temperance descended the stairs with deliberate slowness, taking time to arrange her shawl and smooth her gray hair before answering the door. Every second of delay might mean the difference between capture and escape for the two fugitives making their way through the maze of alleys toward the river docks. "Dr. Crowthorne," she said, with the gracious formality that wealthy Southern women wielded like armor. "How thoughtful of you to call so early. I trust you slept better than I did after last night's tragic events." Crowthorne's response was clipped and professional. He had come to examine Westcombe's wineglass and to question the household servants about their master's final meal. The constables carried handcuffs and a warrant for the arrest of the slave girl known as Celia on charges of murder by poisoning. But when they searched the servants' quarters, they found only an empty pallet and a loose floorboard that had been hastily replaced. Celia's few possessions were gone, along with any trace of the small fortune she had accumulated through years of patient theft. The constables questioned the other servants, but their answers revealed nothing useful. Yes, Celia had seemed distressed by Westcombe's death. No, she had not appeared to be planning an escape. No one had seen her leave the property, and no one could explain her sudden disappearance. Police report, August 26, 1855. Search of the premises revealed evidence of recent flight. Suspect believed to be traveling north toward Illinois border with unknown accomplice. As the morning wore on and the search expanded to neighboring properties, Temperance found herself playing an increasingly dangerous game. She answered every question with perfect honesty while revealing nothing of substance. Yes, she had seen Celia the previous evening. No, the girl had not seemed agitated or unusual in her behavior. No, she had no idea where a runaway slave might go to seek sanctuary. The lies came easily because they were not technically lies at all. She had indeed seen Celia, but she omitted mentioning the mysterious companion or the bundle they carried. The girl had not seemed agitated because she had displayed remarkable composure for someone planning murder and escape. And Temperance truly had no specific knowledge of underground railroad routes, even if she suspected they existed. But as the constables prepared to expand their search beyond the immediate neighborhood, Temperance realized that her small act of rebellion had set much larger forces in motion. The hunt for Celia would now become a test of how far the Underground Railroad could stretch and whether two women with nothing but courage and stolen silver could outrun the machinery of a system designed to drag them back to bondage or death. The steamboat's paddle wheel churned brown Mississippi water as bounty hunters closed the distance between their fast cutter and the commercial ferry, carrying two women whose freedom hung in the balance of the next 3 hours. Celia crouched behind a stack of cotton bales, clutching Serafina's hand as shouts echoed across the water. This moment would determine whether 20 years of bondage would end in Canadian soil or a Missouri noose, and the river that had carried so many enslaved people to their doom might finally carry two of them to salvation. The docks at St. Charles reeked of fish oil and tar, while the sound of steam engines mixed with the rhythmic slapping of water against wooden hulls. The rough hemp rope of the mooring lines felt coarse beneath Celia's palms, as she and Serafina had climbed aboard the northbound packet boat just after dawn, their stolen silver converted into passage tickets by a sympathetic German immigrant who asked no questions about two colored women traveling without papers. Captain Heinrich Müller had been running freight and passengers between St. Louis and Hannibal for 7 years, and he had learned to recognize the particular desperation of people fleeing bondage. His own family had escaped political persecution in Bavaria, and he understood that some journeys were matters of life and death rather than simple commerce. The first 2 hours had passed without incident. Celia and Serafina huddled among the cargo, sharing cold biscuits and water while the Missouri countryside rolled past. The familiar landmarks of her enslaved life, the great houses perched on bluffs, the cotton fields stretching toward the horizon, gradually gave way to smaller farms and settlements that represented something closer to freedom. But at 10:37 that morning, everything changed. Missouri River Navigation Records, August 1855. Pursuit vessels must yield right-of-way to commercial traffic except in cases of fugitive slave recovery, whereupon all assistance shall be rendered to lawful authorities. The bounty hunters had tracked them through a network of informants that stretched along every major transportation route in Missouri. Slave catchers made their living by maintaining relationships with ferry operators, stagecoach drivers, and railroad conductors who supplemented their income by reporting suspicious travelers. The system was efficient, profitable, and nearly impossible to evade for long. Silas Redmond had posted the bounty himself, offering $500 for Celia's return and an additional $200 for information leading to the capture of her accomplice. It was a fortune that would attract every professional slave hunter within 100 miles of St. Louis, and they had mobilized with the efficiency of men accustomed to tracking human prey. The lead hunter, a grim man named Josiah Pike, had commandeered a steam cutter from the St. Louis harbor and was gaining steadily on Müller's heavily loaded packet boat. His crew carried the legal authority to stop and search any vessel suspected of transporting fugitive slaves, backed by federal marshals who viewed the Underground Railroad as a criminal conspiracy that threatened the economic foundation of the South. Blood follows the current downstream. Captain Müller faced an impossible choice. He could surrender his passengers to the bounty hunters and preserve his commercial license, or he could risk everything to help two women he barely knew. His decision came when he saw Celia's face, not the pleading desperation he might have expected, but a calm acceptance of whatever fate awaited her. She had already killed once, rather than submit to a system that treated her as property. Her expression made it clear that she would die before allowing herself to be dragged back to bondage, and that knowledge changed everything for the German captain. Müller ordered his engineer to increase steam pressure beyond safe operating levels, coaxing extra speed from engines that were already straining against the current. Black smoke poured from the packet boat's twin stacks as the gap between pursuer and pursued narrowed to less than 50 yards. The chase became a deadly game of river navigation and mechanical endurance. Pike's cutter was faster but less maneuverable, while Müller's packet boat carried local knowledge of every sandbar and snag between St. Charles and the Illinois border. The captain used that knowledge ruthlessly, steering his vessel through shallow channels that forced the pursuit boat to reduce speed or risk running aground. Engineering report. Steamboat inspection. 1,855. Boiler explosion remains the primary cause of river fatalities, with overpressurization accounting for 60% of mechanical failures. At 11:15, disaster struck. The packet boat's starboard boiler gauge redlined as steam pressure exceeded design specifications. Müller had pushed his engines too hard for too long, and now he faced the choice between slowing down to safe operating parameters or risking an explosion that would kill everyone aboard. Serafina pressed her face against Celia's shoulder as the deck beneath them began to vibrate with mechanical stress. They could hear Pike's men shouting across the narrowing gap, their voices carrying the casual confidence of hunters who sensed cornered prey. The Illinois shore was visible now, less than a mile away, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles if the boiler exploded before they reached it. What would you do if freedom lay just beyond your reach, but claiming it meant risking the lives of innocent people who had chosen to help you? That question would be answered in the next 10 minutes, because Captain Mueller was about to make a decision that would either save them all or kill them all. And the margin for error had just disappeared entirely. Captain Heinrich Mueller's hand hovered over the emergency steam release valve as the boiler pressure gauge needle trembled at the red line. While 50 yards behind them, Josiah Pike raised his rifle and took aim at the packet boat's pilot house. The next 30 seconds would determine whether Celia's act of rebellion would end in freedom, death, or a return to the living hell of Missouri bondage. This moment would prove whether sometimes the only way to escape an unjust system is to risk destroying everything, including yourself, rather than submit to its machinery of human degradation. The Illinois shoreline stretched before them like a promise, written in mud and willows, while the sound of straining metal mixed with the rhythmic splash of the paddle wheel and the increasingly frantic shouts of the bounty hunters. The rough wooden deck planks vibrated beneath Celia's knees as she crouched behind cotton bales, feeling the entire vessel shudder under mechanical stress that threatened to tear it apart at any moment. Mueller made his choice with the calm precision of a man who had already calculated the odds and accepted the consequences. Instead of releasing steam pressure to save his engines, he opened the throttles to maximum and aimed his overloaded packet boat directly at the narrowest part of the channel, where jagged limestone bluffs rose from both sides of the river like the walls of a canyon. The gamble was mathematically simple, but practically suicidal. Pike's steam cutter was faster in open water, but it drew more water than Mueller's boat. If the packet boat could reach the shallows first, the pursuit vessel would be forced to halt or risk running hard aground on the limestone shelves that lined the approach to the Illinois landing. But the plan required the engines to hold together for exactly 7 more minutes, and the starboard boiler was already showing stress fractures along its primary seam. River Pilot's Handbook, 1855. The Illinois approach presents numerous hazards during low water periods, with limestone shelves extending up to 30 yards from shore, at depths insufficient for deep draft vessels. Pike realized Mueller's strategy and responded with the ruthless efficiency of a professional slave hunter. He ordered his crew to open fire on the packet boat's pilot house, hoping to kill or wound the captain before the dangerous maneuver could be completed. Rifle balls splintered the wooden superstructure as Mueller hunched over his wheel, steering by instinct and memory through channels he had navigated hundreds of times in safer circumstances. One bullet shattered the starboard window, sending glass fragments across the pilot house floor. Another splintered the doorframe inches from Mueller's head. But the German captain held his course, his hands steady on the wheel despite the blood running down his face from flying splinters. Celia watched the drama unfold with the same detached calm she had shown while poisoning Westcombe. Death had become a familiar companion over the past week, and she found herself strangely at peace with whatever fate awaited her. She had tasted revenge, had struck a blow against the system that had enslaved her, and had experienced a few hours of something that resembled freedom. That might be enough. The mathematics of justice. At 11:43 that morning, Captain Muller's gamble paid off. The packet boat scraped over the limestone shelf with inches to spare, its hull grinding against submerged rocks as it lurched into the shallow channel that led to the Illinois landing. Behind them, Pike's deeper draft cutter struck the same shelf with a grinding crash that tore away part of its keel and left it stranded in 3 feet of water. The bounty hunters were trapped, their vessel damaged and immobilized, while their quarry limped toward shore with a fractured hull and engines that were seconds away from catastrophic failure. Pike stood in his pilot house, rifle still smoking, watching helplessly as Celia and Serafina disappeared into Illinois territory. But their escape came at a terrible cost. The packet boat's starboard boiler finally surrendered to the excessive pressure exploding in a geyser of steam and scalding water that killed 2 passengers and left Captain Mueller with burns that would eventually claim his life. The blast also destroyed most of the cargo and left the vessel listing heavily as it reached the Illinois shore. Emergency responders from the river town of Grafton pulled survivors from the wreckage. But in the chaos that followed the explosion, no one noticed 2 young women slipping away into the dense woods that lined the Mississippi's eastern banks. By the time Pike's crew had freed their damaged cutter and reached the Illinois landing, Celia and Serafina had vanished into the Underground Railroad network that would eventually carry them to Canada and genuine freedom. Canadian immigration records, 1,856. Colored refugees from American slavery continue to arrive via Detroit and Niagara crossings, with approximately 3,000 new arrivals documented this year. The official investigation into Obadiah Westcombe's death concluded that he had died from natural causes, possibly related to an undiagnosed heart condition aggravated by excessive wine consumption. Dr. Procated, Crowthorne's evidence of belladonna poisoning was dismissed as inconclusive, and the case was quietly closed to avoid embarrassing questions about how an enslaved girl had managed to murder her master and escape to freedom. Temperance Fairvale used her inheritance to secretly fund Underground Railroad operations throughout Missouri, spending the remainder of her life helping other enslaved people follow the path that Celia and Serafina had pioneered. She died in 1862, taking her knowledge of the poisoning to the grave. What would you do if justice required you to become everything the law said you could never be? Free, powerful, and dangerous. The bounty on Celia's head remained active until the Civil War made such pursuits irrelevant, but she was never captured or identified by authorities in any jurisdiction. She had committed the perfect crime and achieved the perfect escape, proving that even the most oppressive system contained cracks through which the determined could slip toward freedom. Local historians in Grafton still whisper about the mysterious women who disappeared from the steamboat explosion, and some claim that on foggy nights along the Illinois shore, you can still hear echoes of their laughter carried on the river wind. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.